In this video, we're going to discuss open source software. One preliminary note, open source software is not the same as public domain software, and open source does not mean that something is not subject to copyright. Instead, open source software is software that actually is subject to copyright. In fact, the copyright rights are used to release this software under license terms that allow people to make certain uses of the software, but subject to some very important restrictions. So in particular for startups that are using open source software and then releasing software as part of their products or services, you should probably think of open source software not as free software, but as software that is subject to certain strings that are attached. Let's talk about some of those strings that may be attached. Open source software licenses come in all different shapes and sizes. Some are highly restrictive and highly viral, meaning that downstream releases of software, including some of that open source software, need to be released under the exact same terms included in the inbound open source license, or they can be much less restrictive, saying you can use this open source software and you can release it and use it under any terms you want, including proprietary software terms for commercial uses. Most open source licenses have some terms in common, and a couple of these terms would include free distribution of the software, releasing or making available the source code for the software along with any software release, and a requirement that a downstream user be able to make modifications or derivative works based upon that software, including the inbound open source code. Entrepreneurs and startups often get into trouble with open source code when they use some code subject to an open source license, and then that code is incorporated in a product or service that is released to their customers or partners, and either the software or the startup company is not aware that the open source code is included, or they're releasing it under terms that are inconsistent with the terms of the inbound open source license. So it's really important to track any open source code that you're using so you can make sure that the downstream release is compliant with the open source license terms that you have agreed upon, whether or not you know it when you've used that open source code in your product or service. It's important to know that ignorance is not a defense to problems with open source licenses. People often get confused because independent creation is typically a defense to a copyright infringement claim. In other words, you could independently create work that may be substantially similar to someone else's copyrighted work, and if you really haven't had access to the copyrighted work, what you've done is probably okay, even though your expression is substantially similar to theirs, because you haven't in fact copied their copyrighted work. But that's different than being ignorant or unaware of the license terms to which you've agreed when you're using someone else's code, because you have had access to that code. You're using it in the product or service you're creating, so that there's probably substantial similarity. So you're exercising one of the exclusive rights of the copyright holder, which you can only do with their authorization, which only comes if you're complying with their license terms that come with their code. So let's talk about some things that your startup can do to make sure it doesn't run into problems with open source software. The first is you need to track any open source code that your engineers are using. You need to make sure that people are documenting when they're taking open source code off the internet or that they're finding in some other way, so that you can make sure you know whether that code's incorporated in your product or service, and you know the nature of that code so you can make sure you comply with its terms. That brings us to the second point, the terms matter. Not all open source licenses are the same, and so you need to know the particular open source license that governs the open source code you've used and the particular terms, including that license, so you make sure you comply with those terms. Again, some terms are going to be highly restrictive and not allow you to use that code in a commercial release of a product or service. Others may be more permissive. A third point is to make sure you review any software that was not created in-house, because if it's come from some other source, you need to make sure that you have authorization or that you otherwise have rights, perhaps under fair use, to use that software or that code that was not created in-house. And the last point is that there are some products available now to track and look for open source code, because perhaps if you were using some open source code or there are many contributors to your project, it can be hard to know what components are subject to an open source license or were created other than in-house. And there are some products available now to look at your code and to hopefully detect open source licenses or open source code, so you can go back, find the license, and make sure you're complying with the terms of that license. That's a very general overview of the issue of open source software and how to avoid problems when you're a startup.